Hi everyone, welcome back to session 16, Behavior Acquisition. As we approach the new year, we are oftentimes asked by friends of ours and relatives, what are your New Year's resolutions? And this is also the time of the year that you start seeing commercials coming on board for Nutrisystem and all these other exercise programs, and getting people to take advantage of the fact that the new year starts all over. Behavioral promises that were not kept in the past will be kept in the future, and now's a good time to start. Although I always wonder what makes January 1st any different than any other day. But, once again, one of the reasons why people pick this particular day is that it's a very conspicuous day. That is, this is a day that everybody looks to other individuals to set new goals. And oftentimes, if they're made too public, you'll be very embarrassed when you get 2 weeks into your new year and you can't meet your goal and you just give up. Interestingly enough, a friend of mine sent me an email about this bar. I think it's in California called Resolutions. And I don't know whether this is true or not, but apparently for the first 2 weeks of every year, this location actually starts off as a genuine gymnasium with all kinds of weight programs and trainers and stuff like that. And that goes on for 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, the place closes down. And for the next 50 weeks, it turns into a bar, which is why they call it Resolutions. I don't know if it's a joke or something like that. If it's not, it's actually a pretty funny idea. In any case, when we talk about behavior acquisition, what we're really talking about here are how we establish contingencies of reinforcement, either for other people or, in fact, for ourselves, that we will impose contingencies so that we can actually acquire new behaviors, sustain these behaviors. Perhaps we might even want conspicuous control on making resolutions to stop certain behaviors, quitting smoking, and some of these other types of New Year's resolutions. And we'll be talking about that shortly when we get to sections on behavior reduction. When we talk about behavior acquisition, though, we want to know exactly how conspicuous the contingencies of reinforcement are. For example, when we have an arrangement with individuals, we set up contracts. This is the most conspicuous form of acquisition when you're looking at the relationship between the person who you're going to work for and yourself, the contract that you might establish between you and a bank, you and a real estate agent, and so forth and so on. These are explicit contingencies of reinforcement that describe the expectations of behaviors on both sides. But not just the expectations, but clear consequences. What happens if those expectations are not fulfilled? This, by the way, is one of the reasons why we end up using token economies in some of our settings. It's certainly not the first choice that we want to use, but the reason why we have a token economy is because sometimes it makes reinforcer contingencies more explicit, but more importantly, individuals who really cannot sustain a great deal amount of behavior over the long periods of time, waiting for unconditioned reinforcers that come their way, may actually have to have these long periods of time mediated. And this is where certainly token deliveries could be used, verbal praise could be used, and those sorts of things. In the normal setting, we don't necessarily use token economies, but perhaps at our work settings, we use 3-month evaluations, 6-month evaluations. These are things that are planned throughout the entire year, and then perhaps at the end of the year might get a pay adjustment, maybe not. But throughout the year, they provide these reviews to let you know how you're doing. But these are contingencies of reinforcement. How are you doing on your job responsibilities? Are you doing what you're supposed to do? Are you meeting the criteria? Are you meeting productivity? Boy, if you're in the hospital settings or the rehab settings, you hear that an awful lot. How often are you meeting your productivity goals? Okay, so in looking at behavior acquisition, what we're going to start doing now is actually start utilizing some of the things that we've learned so far in the class. For example, if we're going to use certain schedules of reinforcement, we certainly know which schedules are the best ones to use. You start off with continuous FR1, continuous reinforcement. You get the behavior going. Then you start fading the schedule to a variable ratio or a variable interval schedule. If you're going to do response acquisition, you're going to be looking for shaping and you want a high degree of successes, you're going to want to use an errorless discrimination procedure. It's one of the best ways to acquire behavior and then to bring that behavior under good stimulus control. And of course, once we start using these particular techniques, you will learn some of the other techniques that will help you fade schedules of reinforcement out more effectively so that the behavior just simply doesn't fall apart. And more importantly, we always want to keep an eye on the naturalistic setting. That is, where is this person, this individual going in time? We certainly cannot utilize a token economy in the long haul, and we want to use more naturalistic reinforcers. But how do we use those? We don't just sit down and say, this is more naturalistic than that. How do we get from point A to point B? We could always point out where our goals are, but building a transition bridge is a little bit more difficult. And this is some of the things that I think the experimental analysis of behavior will really start helping you out in terms of seeing things in the contingencies of reinforcement that most people don't see. And this is also including many people who have been doing behavioral programming for years. Understanding schedules and schedule reinforcers and concurrent schedules and matching law and many of the other tools that are in the experimental analysis and have been used for years will be some of the things that you could use to your advantage to develop more effective treatment plans. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and freeze, and we're going to go ahead and get started on behavior acquisition, so bear with me. Okay, and I believe I got my pointer ready to go, and let me get the screen full screen. Now, to start this off, I'll share with you a cartoon that I've actually shared with people over the years in my classes. Forgive, but there's a reason why I use this cartoon over the years. Okay, this is called Fat Freddy's Cat. And you see Fat Freddy here with the cat who's seemingly very tired of buying the cat. Well, you could actually read this. I'll leave this here for a couple of seconds. Okay, and if we advance, and there you go. There's the joke. Now, the reason why I brought this up here, because as we talk about behavior acquisition, this cartoon really shows you everything wrong about most of the training that we use. And this is just one of the very first examples in which we see here that look at the stimulus conditions under which teaching is about to take place. Okay. Clearly, Fat Freddy, and that's his name, this is Fat Freddy and Fat Freddy's cat. Fat Freddy is very upset and annoyed about having to buy cat litter, and it's very expensive. So instead, he's seemingly under aversive control himself to teach the cat another behavior so that will lower his costs and put him in a better position to buy probably drugs, which is what Fat Freddy's usually bought in those days. And what you see here is him teaching the cat and using aversive control to teach the cat to do a behavior, which, by the way, the cat already knows how to do. It's the stimulus conditions under which the behavior is being learned here. Getting away from kitty litter versus going into the toilet. So you see the disposition by the person who's doing the teaching right from the very beginning is totally off. It's emphasized here, which indicates that his emotions are running high. And poor Fat Freddy's cat here has no idea what he is saying and what he is requesting. We note here that Fat Freddy did not keep going with this training. In fact, he expected the learning to take place within a very short period of time, perhaps within about 1 minute. And instead he just says, okay, that's it. It doesn't work. I give up. And he walks away. And then, of course, Fat Freddy's cat looks around a little bit and then emits the response under the wrong stimulus conditions and so forth. And there's the joke. But again, this is not really that much of a joke if you've actually gone into many learning settings that I've gone into and see that teaching is done under very duress kinds of conditions. A lot of times the positive reinforcers are not in the environment. The aversive control and the negative reinforcers certainly are. I better get this picture out of here before somebody has something to say about it. Okay, so the origins of new behavior essentially involves shaping. in which we do two things. One, we differentially reinforce behavior, in which we say that under differential reinforcement, reinforcer delivery is contingent upon one form of a response and not delivered for other forms of response. Now, what this automatically entails is that when we use differential reinforcement, it really is two procedures: reinforcement and extinction. Okay, this is really important to understand. Certainly you saw that when we talked about the Jenkins and Harrison experiment back under stimulus control. Yes, remember that? That's the stimulus generalization gradients. And there was no discrimination training taking place. That is, there was a flat generalization gradient if you were just simply presenting different stimuli. It was only when reinforcement was delivered in the presence of one stimulus and reinforcement was not delivered in the presence of another stimulus. They just simply shut off the tone, which is an extinction procedure. And again, this is important to note here that all reinforcement and extinction procedures are both involved when we talk about differential reinforcement. Okay? It's not just reinforcement. Now, once we are able to shape a response, and the behavior is established, we now have to change the criteria. This is called successive approximation, in which we start off with a small approximation, perhaps a small response, and start increasing the response requirements a little bit over time, changing the reinforcement criteria. Under one set of circumstances, it works, and the organism learns very quickly how to do the behavior, but then the situations shift. And when it shifts, behavior shifts gradually. You will recall way back when we talked about operant behavior, I showed you the situation in which the rat was in the chamber and it had a slot cut into one of the walls, and we saw their positions 1 through 15 looking at baseline, in which we wanted to see how many times the rat stuck its nose in between each of these little places along the wall, on the left side of the wall all the way to the right side of the wall. And you could see during unreinforced conditions, baseline, we see that predominantly this particular rat was placing its nose and sniffing and smelling probably from the left to the center and not much from the center to the right. So one of the interesting things to think about here is, how would you shape the response to go from here over to here? Well, again, you start simply doing differential reinforcement. You see in graph B that if we start reinforcing only nose pokes from position 7 to 15, you see here, this is the region, and this is going to be the reinforced region, we automatically see an increase in the frequency of a response. But we also see an increase over here in the frequency of unreinforced response. And recall, this is that spread effect that you see when you start doing differential reinforcement. That is, all behaviors go up. It's what we call induction. But over a period of time, if we start changing the criteria from 7 to 15, and down here we go from 9 to 15. Now all of these areas will be reinforced. And then we continue on and simply change the criteria a little bit more and go from 11 to 15. Do you see this shaping process? We are selectively changing the approximation, and ultimately our goal is to see if we can get these behaviors to occur in positions 13, 14, and 15 where they're not occurring now. And little by little, when you change successive criteria, look what's happening to the distribution of nose pokes. It just simply shifts according to the distribution. And by the way, the same thing happens when you are shaping using differential reinforcement of short IRTs to long IRTs. We could see this kind of behavior if we were going to call these, instead of positions, these were seconds. 1 second, 5 second, 10 second, 15 second. And we are looking at IRTs. We are looking at very, very short IRTs here and virtually no long IRTs over here. In other words, you got a lot of impulsive behavior, higher rate of behavior, right? Short IRTs, higher rate. And now if we start reinforcing only IRTs that are 7 seconds long, and then we shift it so we start reinforcing IRTs that are 9 seconds or longer, or 10 seconds or longer, or 14 seconds or longer, look what's happening to the distribution of IRTs if this were IRTs. And again, we could do the same thing with this type of contingency of reinforcement as well. The main thing to note here is that once you have the behaviors established, you could shift the reinforcement criteria, but you want to make sure that the behaviors were sampled. You can see here that you saw at least one behavior in the region of here, some here, some here. So if you're going to start your shaping criteria, you want to start it right about here because you got to make sure that behavior could be emitted. This is why Catania started this right about at 7, because at position 7, there was enough behavior in baseline condition to actually reinforce. Supposing Catania started right over here, position 14, and made this the very first criteria, the chances are, well, the rat might make it. You know, there's always an outside chance, but you've minimized the opportunities because the rat never emitted a nose poke in position 15. So if you all of a sudden set that as a criteria, how are you going to get them there? They've never emitted it. This is where this whole idea of changing successive approximation works beautifully because you could take advantage of what the animal is doing and simply shift it downward. Okay. Now, we call differential reinforcement of successive approximation, which is quite a mouthful, shaping. And this is a process by which new behaviors are built into the organism's repertoire using reinforcement and extinction, and by which simple responses can give rise to much more complex responses, in particular language. Okay? Shaping process can also occur not only with differential reinforcement using reinforcement and extinction, but it also will work using variations in magnitudes of reinforcement. That is, if you reinforce 2 responses, but there's 3 times more reinforcement on the left side versus the right side, you could get behavior to actually shift to the left. Okay, and vice versa to the right as well. Okay, all right. Now, the adaptive significance of shaping should be very apparent. Operants, unlike respondents, have no eliciting stimuli, and since waiting for designated behaviors to occur naturally in order to reinforce it may be impossible or dangerous. That is, if we have to wait for a final behavior for it to occur, in its proper form, how are we going to do? Let's talk about, for example, teaching somebody to walk across the street in the pedestrian crosswalks. Now, there are no eliciting stimuli to do this. That is clearly a learned behavior, but we would not necessarily want to start, looking at bringing them over to the crosswalks. We may want to, or at least a complex one, we may start at an early or a simple location, someplace where it's less crowded, someplace where it's easier to teach. We would want to make sure that the person who is learning this behavior should be able to recognize the direction of travel. They should be able to tell a red light from a green light, and they should be able to also be able to tell when it's time to don't cross the street, wait, because when the light is flashing red and it says don't cross, we don't want that person to cross. So again, what we're talking about here is a seemingly simple discrimination, right? Cross when it's red, stop when it's green, don't cross when it's green, and wait for the light to change. But you can see it's a fairly complex behavior in the conditions under which this discrimination is taking place. So it should be no surprise we could also do a lot of this training in a classroom. We could teach pedestrian training on a tabletop activity. We can kind of learn it through watching on television and so forth. Perhaps we should learn to cross Sesame Street, and we learn which way to cross when the light is red or versus green. Okay. And again, the whole process of shaping, and we will talk about this later, is extremely adaptive for the evolution of cultures and the selection of cultural practices that have survival value. And at the very end of the course, we'll get into the issues of cultural practices, where they come from. And we will see that operant behavior and cultural practices are one and the same thing. It's either the behavior of one individual in a culture, operant behavior, or the behavior of many individuals in a culture where there's one operant but many ways to achieve that, such as cutting energy costs, energy saving sorts of things, green earth types of ideas. That is an operant type of behavior, but there are many ways to achieve the goals of a clean environment. All right. Now, when we talk about shaping behavior, I want to go over some of the things that we look at when we want to enhance the shaping process. So what exactly do we do in the laboratory? And you'll see that it's not much different in the classroom situations. We start off with what we call reinforcer deprivation. If we are going to work with a pigeon or a rat or a monkey, animals that are at their what we call free feed, that they are, eat as much as they could possibly eat, will be not motivated to do much behavior to get food. So what we would actually do to start off our experiments is to bring in these special laboratory bred rats. They could be hooded rats or other kinds of rats. And we would bring them in and put them in a chamber and let them eat as much food as they possibly want to eat. And the way you do this is pretty simple. You just fill their food cups with as much water and food as they could possibly eat. And each day you just simply weigh them day after day after day until you establish what is called free feeding weight. Now, let's say, for example, I have a female hooded rat that I'm working. By the way, a hooded rat is nothing more than a black and white rat. And I'm working with a hooded rat. And at free feed, the rat is 100 grams. And I know this because I've been weighing them for the past week. That's the value. The average value is about 100 grams per day. And then I go in what's called reinforcer deprivation. And here all I do is simply, instead of giving them free food all the time, now I will just give them rations of food, which is approximately a certain amount to sustain a certain body weight. And what I'm trying to do is bring their body weight down to what's called 80% of their free feed weight. And this is just simply established by knowing that if you got a rat that's 100 grams, you want to bring them down to about 80 grams of each day. And that would be what we call 80% of their free feed weight. This really doesn't take long to do. And in general, we note that most animals in the wild are much lower in their terms of their weights. They're much lower than 80% in the wild, which is why animals are constantly foraging for food, because food patches are oftentimes scarce. The same thing with most pets. They are kept at usually 80% or less of their free feed weight. In other words, we do not usually, and if we do, we shouldn't do this, we don't give animals all the food that they want to eat all day long. And in fact, if you do, vets will tell you that's a really bad thing to do. Particularly if you have certain kinds of dogs that as they get older, I have a golden retriever that's prone to hip dysplasia, and it becomes more of a burden and bad health if they carry a lot of weight on them. So I'm always very careful about making sure that they eat well, they exercise, that my dog exercises all the time, that I don't give him a lot of snack foods, and if I do, it's usually something, maybe a couple of pieces of popcorn. And anyway, we see here that reinforcer deprivation is important to use in order to get a rat motivated for food. Okay, and by the way, this is called an establishing operation, something you'll talk about later on in other classes. That is, we establish food to be a reinforcer by simply making sure that the rat occasionally does not have food or has a low amount of food, and that would serve as a very powerful reinforcer. The second thing we will do is, once we have a rat now at 80% of their free feed weight, we may actually go in and place the rat into the chamber, experimental chamber, and do absolutely nothing. And when you put a rat into a chamber, what they're going to do is they do a lot of running around. They just run around and around and around, rear up, go down, sniff around. They do a lot of exploration. And this is a lot of the emotional behavior because and again, it's in quotes, this is just what rats do when they are placed in novel environments that they've never seen before. It's simply exploratory kinds of behaviors. If you've ever brought home a puppy, you'll see the same sort of thing. Puppies are a little bit emotional. Cats are a little bit emotional. If you have a pet bird, you'll see the same sort of thing. When they get into the environment, they've got to get to know what their environment is. For dogs, the inside as well as the outside yard is very important for them to learn and get adapted to their environment. The next thing we might want to do is, after they've gotten used to their environment and they're less stressful, and by the way, if you're working with pigeons, it's just the opposite. You take a pigeon and put it in the chamber, at least the ones that I've worked with, they don't move, they just freeze. You're sitting there, you're wondering, is this pigeon still alive or not? And no, they are really not that active in these environments. But over time, what you see is a little bit of change of behavior. That happens when you go to reinforcer sampling. For a rat, what you may do is, once the rat's in the chamber, now you just drop some free little pellets of food in the very front of the chamber, And it does not take long. That rat is scrambling around, and they will come in contact with those pellets of food and scarf it up, particularly if they're at 80% of their free feed weight. Just like dogs and cats will do when they see novel foods in the environment, they'll scarf it up. Okay? Um, and then what you're establishing here is not only that food is a reinforcer, but you're also establishing that staying in proximity to the front of the chamber where the food cup is a very good thing to do. Certainly food's more often delivered in the front of the chamber than the back of the chamber. And all of a sudden the rat is now standing closer to the front of the chamber, which conveniently has a lever and has some lights and has other things. Now with a pigeon will oftentimes just stand there and do nothing while the food hopper is raised in the position and held in the where the light is shining down on the food in the food aperture. And eventually what you see over time is that the pigeon will take one step closer and then stop. And then maybe take another step closer, then stop. And then as time passes, and if you're not too bored, you should watch this. It really takes a while to happen. But eventually, the pigeon will find the food, stick their head into the food aperture. They'll eat it, and of course, the food will be there for a little while until they clear out the hopper. And then all of a sudden, the hopper swings back. It makes this big clunking noise, and of course, that freaks the pigeon out. And that's just one more thing that has to undergo adaptation. It does not take long. And once you're really good at shaping behavior, you can get these animals responding pretty quickly on the operant key or on the lever. Now, at the very beginning, you'll find out that what does the rat do in this situation like that? We do what's called the operant level of response. It's the baseline. And with pigeons, they may or may not peck a lit key. In fact, the odds are that it probably won't, although we have some very clever arrangements in which we could do something called auto-shaping. But sometimes when the rat is over in the chamber and we drop food in the chamber, the lever is also hooked up so that the first lever press will deliver food to the rat. So the rat actually could get it two ways. One, by just undergoing the reinforcer sampling procedure, the experimenter is simply dropping food into the chamber until the rat finds the food, and eventually we're going to do some shaping. But it has happened in which, just in the natural process of things, the rat is, climbing, rearing down, leaning up against the wall, rearing down, and it just so happens they come in contact with a lever, and boom, they hit the lever, they deliver a pellet of food for themselves, and they may be shaped from that point on. Okay, so again, that may be through the process of adventitious reinforcement. It was just an accidental sort of thing that they came in contact with a lever and reinforced themselves, and they're often running to the races. But oftentimes, we're not necessarily that lucky, and we have to do what's called differential reinforcement of successive approximation, in which what we need to do is now we will not just simply drop food into the chamber wherever the rat is. We'll only drop food into the chamber when the rat is close to the front wall. And little by little, we could shape the behavior over time until as they get closer and closer to the wall, we deliver food. And then we may wait until a little bit of a period of time. They go over there. They're not getting food. They're not getting any food. And all of a sudden, they move a little bit closer. Successive approximation. Okay, and this is the shaping process that we would use in the experimental chamber. Now, interestingly enough, it's not too far off if you've ever worked with kids in daycare centers. Now, I'm not saying we deprive them of reinforcers, but in a sense, what we end up doing a lot of times is we drop kids off at a daycare center. Maybe the parents may stay with the child for a couple of minutes, but essentially at some point in time, that parent leaves, and there is now only that child, other children, and the people who are in the daycare center. And at that point, a significant person in that child's life is no longer available. And what you oftentimes will see is emotional behavior of that child crying and screaming, "I want my mommy," and so forth. I certainly went through this 2 times with my kids, and it did not take them long to get over that. In fact, I think a lot of times the directors of these programs say, just go, leave, we've got it under control. It's going to hurt you more than it's going to hurt them. They'll get over it. And over a period of time, the child, may start clinging to the teacher. We might encourage the child to say, "Why don't you come over here and let me show you some of the things that you could play with over here." And she'll bring the child over to one area of the room which has Legos, Maybe another area of the room has arts and crafts and beads and sparkly things to play with. Another part of the play area might actually have play school toys. They may take the child outside and show them the playground and so forth. And what you're going to do at that point in time, if you're a good teacher, is as the child's behavior undergoes adaptation and they become less emotional, you start seeing the child sampling the various kinds of activities that are there. And you get a very good sense that wherever the child seems to be spending a great deal more time would be likely places that would serve as reinforcers. If you have 6 different locations or stations of playthings in a particular play area, it does not take long for a teacher to identify which one the child is spending the most time at. And that would be the one to guess that that's probably the reinforcer. Now, let's say you have a child who finds arts and crafts reinforcing. They sit down and they start going through crayons. And now a teacher may actually want to determine an operant level. What does this child know? Certainly they could ask the parent, but it doesn't take long for a teacher to simply sit down with a child and say, oh, can you draw me a picture? Can you pick up, which color do you like? Do you like the red crayon or the blue crayon? Can they identify colors by simply picking it up? When they are drawing, you could ask them, can you draw a straight line? Can you draw a house? Can you draw a stick figure? Can you draw the grass, the sky? And then you could also not only see what the child is able to draw, but also can, if you point to it, say, what is this? What is that? And if the child is able to, identify, or what we say, tact, these various things in the picture. And then you might say, this is a beautiful picture. I'd like to hang this up. Could you write your name on the bottom so I could hang it up by my desk? Now you have an opportunity to sample, does the child know how to print their name, yes or no? Okay. And then finally, once the teacher knows this, the teacher's in the best position to know what can they do and what can they do, what can't they do. And I will shape these behaviors to help them learn a little bit more and so forth and so on. Okay. Now I'm going to show you a couple of pictures here of some pretty complex behaviors. This is Barnabas the rat. And Barnabas the rat was trained a very complex repertoire to do the following. Barnabas was required to climb a spiral staircase, and when Barnabas got to the top, he would walk across a drawbridge that would lower and allow him to walk across and get to the other side. And once across the other side, Barnabas had to climb up the ladder, okay, and then enter a little trolley car. And the trolley car was able to move by simply having Barnabas move it with his paws. That is, if he moved it in a downward motion on his paws, it would cause this gear to turn, and Barnabas would propel himself across, climb the stairs, go through a paper towel holder roll, and come over here to an elevator. And then Barnabas would lower himself down in the elevator, right, all the way down to the bottom, come over, press the lever, and deliver a pellet of food. Now, of course, you may say, no, not in a million years you can't teach a rat to do this. But here's a picture of the penultimate phase of this particular repertoire, which is the lowering of the elevator prior to the lever press. And you can see Barnabas is doing this. Barnabas did this every single day at Columbia University. Okay, and advances here. This again shows you Barnabas climbing up, going across the drawbridge, climbing the ladder, using his paws like if you've seen rats or hamsters do this, the little habit trail kinds of things, using their paws and so forth. And then finally at the very end, as the elevator was going down, the flag to Columbia University with a little C on the flag was raised every morning. And this was done by at Columbia University. This is the Keller and Schoenfeld laboratories back in the early 50s. Okay, showing you very complex behaviors in a rat. But what's interesting here, if you think about it, I'm going to go back to this, is that what's remarkable is not what the rat is doing, but the context of what they're doing. In other words, the rat is doing what rats normally do in environments. They scurry, they climb, they walk across things, they manipulate with their paws, and they are fairly resourceful. So when you're seeing rats doing these things, rats normally manipulate their environment quite often. We've just placed it within a pretty remarkable context and shaped it up into a fairly stereotypic pattern that we step back and look at and say, wow, isn't that interesting what operant conditioning could do? Okay, but the interesting thing here also is that you'd probably have a much harder time teaching Barnabas to do a handstand or to do something that phylogenetically rats cannot do. Okay? So I'm going to go over a couple of things before we end this section and get into some of the things that we do when we actually go into shaping and how we look at behavioral sequences. First, let's consider the operant response you're trying to teach. Before you start shaping, consider the fact that you need to make sure you could record the behavior in question. What exactly are you trying to shape up? And this gets into the notion of what's called an operational definition of a response. That is, it's observable, it's measurable, and it's a convenient way to record. And not only can you record this, but you could also establish inter-observer agreement if it's an observed behavior, that you make sure that you and several other people are in agreement that when the operant behavior is emitted, it is absolutely emitted, and that you do have inter-observer agreement between instructors or between teachers. Now, the nice thing is that with a lever press and a key pecking, we've got a convenient mechanism that makes the recording ourselves. So we don't necessarily have to observe the behavior. We have a machine that will actually record it for us. And again, what are you going to measure? Are you going to look at how often the behavior occurs, the rate? The duration of the behavior? If you can't get a frequency, you might be able to know that it has temporal extent. It has a beginning or an end. Are you looking at latency, the time between a stimulus and a particular response to be emitted? For example, exiting a house for a fire drill in 2.5 minutes, or whatever the criteria is. That would be the recording at which you sound the alarm, and the timer starts, and the timer stops when the individual gets out of the house or the school or the location and comes to the proper meeting spot, and that is your latency measure. Are they response products? Are you not necessarily looking at behavior, but how many response products are actually emitted? How many objects are actually completed, and so forth and so on? This could be productivity in terms of correct math problems, right? How many term papers are completed? How many examinations do you guys respond to? How often are you guys responding to discussion questions? Those might be response products, and so forth and so on. We need to have a convenient recording method, and this actually I've learned over the years through other operant conditioners how to do this pretty well, but I've learned a great deal about this particular thing of recording operant behavior from actually occupational therapists and rec therapists and physical therapists. These guys are really good. In fact, I've learned a great deal from many occupational therapists who do this on a day-to-day basis. How do you measure whether a person who is undergoing rehab is increasing their range of motion? Or functionally, are they able to actually dress themselves better, able to utilize a toothbrush, able to cook for themselves, getting in and out of bed, getting in and out of a wheelchair? And they've come up with very good, convenient ways of recording and great inter-observer agreements. Okay. Once again, it's one of those, I make the point here that operant conditioners can learn a great deal from people who are in the rehab field who have been doing these things for years, and vice versa, because people in the rehab field could certainly learn a great deal more about not only how to measure behavior, but how to increase the frequency of a particular response, such as accuracy of getting in and out of a wheelchair using positive reinforcement and so forth. We also note here that some behaviors need to be executed at specific rates. That is, some behaviors should occur at high rates because they more closely approximate what is required in order to be on the road, for example. Or they have to execute behavior at slower rates. Again, if we're looking at a person being independent in a particular residential setting, we would want them to be able to execute the response of getting out of a place in case there's an emergency quickly. So we would look at the execution of a behavior at a faster rate. But other behaviors we would want at a slower rate, perhaps making sure checking that doors are locked, making sure that when they are cooking, that they are careful in terms of turning the stove on and off. How they actually are counting their money when they go to a store to make sure that they've got the proper amount of change, rather than just taking the money and stuffing it into their pocket and then 3 hours later seeing that they didn't get the proper change. So these are the things to consider when we're teaching, not just simply a response, but the rate at which it should be emitted. We also want to take advantage of the idea that the more opportunities you have to teach, the quicker you're going to actually have the behavior learned. And this should just simply make a great deal of sense, that the more opportunities we teach somebody, the more we could actually shape. If we are only teaching somebody to exit a house in 2.5 minutes for fire drills, but we only run a fire drill once a month, it's going to take an awfully long time to teach that behavior. Okay, and this is one of the advantages, by the way, in the methods for teaching toilet training. This is a method by Azrin and Fox. You could certainly, it's a book that's been out for many, many years, which takes advantage of many of these things here to teach toilet training quickly. And one of the features that they look at here is increasing the opportunity for shaping by doing a great deal of concentrated shaping. In fact, for a full day, turn off the telephones, turn off the TVs, and sit there and just make shaping, the process of shaping toileting, a lot more fun. You could turn it into a variety of fun activities in terms of practice, role modeling, and so forth. And therefore, again, Azrin and Fox was using this idea that the more opportunities to shape, the better. You also want to take advantage of the fact that some people have idiosyncratic responses, and that if they get in the way of learning a particular response, you may have to take advantage of adaptive equipment. For example, sometimes I work with folks who have had a traumatic brain injury, and they have some degree of paralysis on one side of their body, and if they're trying to optimize using toileting skills or bathing skills, they may not be able to reach a part of their body, or reach over from the left side to the right side to clean their arm or use a washcloth. So you may want to take advantage of perhaps using a brush that has an extended handle. And again, this is one of those things there where we have individuals with a variety of developmental disabilities, and they may have peculiar fine motor movement or gross motor movement. And if we're trying to teach a response, we have to know exactly how that may interfere with learning a particular response. If they are, visually impaired, we have to make sure that we optimize by magnifying aspects of the environment and minimizing things that may get in the way, trip hazards and so forth. Okay. Finally, you want to eliminate influences of respondent behaviors. Learning situations could be quite traumatic for individuals, sometimes more traumatic for some individuals than others. And even within ourselves, some instances that are new and novel evoke respondent behaviors, but they don't necessarily interfere with our behaviors. For example, if I were to go on a cruise, and certainly it's a novel environment, and there are a whole lot of respondent types of stimuli there, as well as reinforcers that are there, and it's a new environment, but I have to learn my way around the ship pretty quickly. Respondent behaviors usually don't get into the way of doing that, although I may salivate as I get closer and closer to the dining room, right? Or I may actually start sweating as I get closer to the sauna or to the pool area and so forth and so on. But it's not an environment that's going to give rise to interfering respondent behaviors. On the other hand, kids in new settings, new schools, kids who have just moved to a brand new school, consumers who have left one environment and going into another, a new day program, a new host home provider, particularly a new host home provider after the previous host home provider might have had some problems with their own behaviors. These are the kinds of things that we have to take into consideration, that a person just doesn't come into an environment ready to engage in operant behavior and learn. We have to really get a good sense of how that person is emotionally, or in the sense of how much respondent behaviors may actually be interfering with learning again. Again, I also work with individuals who have been involved with coming back from traumatic settings such as the war, in Iraq or Afghanistan who have a very hard time learning to adjust to coming back to their civilian lives. Why? Because there is a whole lot of traumatic disorders and respondent behaviors that do get in the way, and we want to eliminate those influences as much as possible. Some instances, we often use perhaps medications that may decrease some of these respondent behaviors to make it easier to learn some of these operant behaviors. Okay? So if a person has perhaps an anxiety disorder, they are highly agitated when they get in certain types of situations, taking a type of medication perhaps like Ativan or Klonopin might eliminate some of those respondent behaviors and now allow for operant behaviors to be learned a little bit easier. Then finally, with our successive approximations, what we want to be aware of is that when we're starting off to teach a response, start off with continuous reinforcement. Reinforce each and every response. Don't let anything get you by. Try to get in there, catch it quickly, optimize it to get it going at a fairly nice rate by reinforcing each and every occurrence. But as soon as you get this behavior going, you're going to want to switch over to intermittent reinforcement, because you'll find that you don't have to reinforce continuously, and that now you only have to reinforce, instead of each response, maybe every 2 or 3 or 4 responses, maybe every 6 or 7 responses a little bit later. In other words, you shift the reinforcement from fixed ratio 1 to variable ratio, whatever that value is, and gradually shift the criteria as they are acquiring the response. And remember, you want that approximation to be within their response distribution. That is, if they're continuously responding and getting reinforced, and they are now going and doing 5 or 6 responses pretty readily, and not having any problem that they could string together the behavior 5 or 6 times, that's good. You don't want to say, okay, they could do it 6 times, now I'll reinforce them if they do it 50 times. Why? Because that's not within their response distribution. It is a rate or a frequency of behavior that's not in their distribution. And in the same way, you recall going back to where that rat was poking its nose, Catania started at position 7. He did not start at position 15, although it was his goal to get to positions 14 and 15. You want to start with an approximation that you know that they could do. This is going to be something we'll come up with and talk about in later classes too, when you start trying to shape and using differential reinforcement of other behaviors or differential reinforcement of replacement